So what you're looking at here is a breeding nursery of alfalfa that I have out here at the UC Davis farm. Lots of alfalfa plants that we put out in the field, take notes on occasionally, and then after a couple of years, select the best ones, hopefully leading to something that's better than is out there now. So what I want to talk about today is breeding and how different terms that we throw around related to seeds are related to breeding programs. And I'll talk about different cultivar types. We'll talk about cultivars in a minute. And then I want to talk about intellectual property protection at the end, or not protection, and what that means in terms of seed saving, in terms of future breeding, and so on. Okay. So land races. So when Margaret asked me to talk, she said there's a lot of these terms that are often thrown around. It's never really clear for everybody what we're talking about. So I'll try to define some of these and hopefully make some sense of it for those of you who have questions. And if you already know what they are, hopefully this will be of some interest. Anyway, so land races, usually these are found around or near the center of origin of a crop species. So for example, in these pictures, these are some old pictures I took in Turkey a number of years ago of small fields of alfalfa that are growing essentially in the center of origin. These are probably land races. So what I mean by land races then is that somebody's simply gone out, found alfalfa that's growing on their farm, harvested seed, planted it back, harvested seed again, and over time had this sort of natural evolution to develop some population of alfalfa plants that perform pretty well. And oftentimes you'll see land races that are named after some region where they're developed or where they're from, maybe named after a local farmer who's sort of shepherded them along. Typically, though, land races are sort of, there's long history behind them and often not particularly selected other than sort of casually selected, maybe when you're harvesting seed, or just naturally selected by whatever's there. And if land races are good performers, then they may eventually become what are called varieties, and you might be able to buy these at local stores, and maybe they move outside of the region as well. But land race is really sort of just taking the plants that are initially around following domestication and producing seed, and year after year maintaining this locally adapted population. So land races are really good sources of broad genetic variation for breeding programs. And even though they have old history, they maybe weren't subjected to scientific breeding, they generally have a lot of good desirable traits that breeders can access today. Okay, so I mentioned this term variety. So what's a variety? Well, this is sort of interesting. So taxonomically or botanically, a variety is just really a variant of a species that has a specific trait. So the example I'm showing here from this really excellent book, I should say, alfalfa is my favorite crop, and maybe my favorite plant. I have to think about that. But this book by Ernest Small about alfalfa and its relatives is really fantastic. But here's an example of a variety. This is yellow-flowered alfalfa. It has glandular hairs on the leaves. And so this is called Medicago sativa, subspecies falcata. Falcata is the yellow-flowered type of alfalfa. And the variety is viscosa. Variety viscosa has these little teeny hairs, maybe you can see on the seed pod here. And so that's really what a variety, when the term variety, that's the real meaning is this in a taxonomic sense. But of course, it's also commonly used to denote what's really a cultivar. Okay, So we often say, I got a new variety of alfalfa, and I'm not talking about viscosa, I'm talking about some seed I'm going to plant. But what I really mean is a new cultivar. And so a cultivar is a cultivated variety. So really what a cultivar is very much like a botanical variety in that somebody has selected selected plants to have specific traits and to reliably express those traits when they're grown in the field or your garden or whatever. And so it is a variety, it has specific traits, and it was selected, by humans, and it's in a crop that's going to be cultivated. So cultivated variety is a cultivar. And so here's an example, this variety of tall fescue, which is a forage grass I was involved with in another life when I was down in Oklahoma. Texoma Max Q2. It's a tall fescue that has really good animal performance. Okay, now heirloom cultivars. So some people talk about heirloom cultivars, or as I said, heirloom varieties, because variety and cultivar are sort of used interchangeably a lot of times. Heirloom cultivars are really, they're somewhat like antiques. You know something about their history. They have some history of, they've come from Romania with somebody's great grandparents, and they grew it for years. And so heirlooms are really just old varieties that have some, as they mentioned down here in this, these are two websites I just went to real quick. You can find lots of them. Of course, many of you know them. Sort of conjuring feelings of nostalgia and comfort. Just because it's an heirloom doesn't mean it's necessarily any good, to be honest. And but it is probably a variety that's been around for a long time, and there is some history there, some history that's known, where it came from, why so-and-so's great-great-grandfather or grandmother selected it in the first place, and what traits it has. So heirlooms, there's nothing really magical about heirlooms other than they're sort of historical varieties with some significance. Okay. So I want to kind of move into talking about plant breeding and really developing new cultivars. How do we go about doing that? And we can look at things in a couple ways. Seed saving is simply harvesting seeds to grow next year. That's basically what the early people who domesticated crops did. They harvested whatever's there and naturally selected bigger seeds and things like that. And of course, many of you maybe even go out in your garden and save seeds of things that you like. Maybe they're heirlooms, maybe something you like to have around because you have some history of the variety. Beyond seed saving, then we can go into thinking about selecting. You're growing some things in the garden. You find some that are particularly nice for whatever reason. You harvest seed from those, and you're doing some selection. Maybe you're developing something that's going to be a little bit different than what's there now. But then there's breeding, which is actively hybridizing different plants that have different characteristics and looking for new recombinants. And this is the real excitement in plant breeding, getting new recombinants that have different traits or trait values. And that's something then that you can evaluate in the following year, make further selections and so on. But all these are connected. And generally, when you're even just doing seed saving, you're probably doing some measure of selection at the same time. Now, the ultimate goal of plant breeding and of doing these crosses and so on is to develop new cultivars that'll be useful to somebody. And here's an example that from Instagram of Kristen Leach's second generation seeds. There's different cultivars of various crops. And so, gardeners buy these, they like try different things and so on. And so plant breeders, whether professional breeders or amateur breeders, anybody can be a plant breeder. The idea that you have to have a PhD or something to do plant breeding, of course, is ridiculous. People have been breeding for a long time. 10,000 years, really. And you can just do it by having a good eye. But anyway, you're trying to find something that's unique and something that's interesting, and then that's a new cultivar. Okay. So the breeding process, I always like to use this example from Darwin of pigeon fanciers who took the old regular old pigeon here in the middle, and just by knowing nothing at all about genetics, simply by mating pigeons that had particular characteristics, they got all these weird types of pigeons around the periphery here. And really, I mean, this is all breeding is having some end goal in mind and then selecting toward that goal. And I think that's actually, in breeding, that's a big thing, kind of having an idea where you want to go. I mean, if you were just like randomly crossing cool looking pigeons, you probably aren't going to end up with these like fantails or something. So you have to go and, only select the fantails to get fantails. Now, Bill Tracy, who's a sweetcorn breeder, does a lot of work with organic breeding up in Wisconsin, has this excellent quote that said the direct effect of selection is remarkably predictable and precise. So if you know what you want, you can get it, as those pigeon fanciers showed. And the real simplistic view of breeding is you start with germplasm. I'm going to come back to this later on too, but germplasm that you get from various sources. Like you get to start with some plants that you're going to hybridize or recombine, evaluate, select, and then keep going around. And breeding is sort of cyclic if you want to keep making improvements, and sort of a black box in general. Genetically, we don't really know what's happening, but at the other end come out cultivars that have the traits we want if we know what we're after and if there's genetic variation for them. So a couple things, points of interest, that even if you don't know anything about genetics, if the trait is heritable and there's genetic variation, then selection is going to be successful. And the second point is, if you don't select for something, you're not going to get it. And that's actually a really important point, because a lot of times you might have in your starting germplasm some trait that you want, and you think that, well, that'll always be there, so I'll just do other things. But if you don't select for it, you might actually lose something that you really need. Okay. So, all right. So this slide, I tried to animate it, and I ended up with a big mess. And so I'm going to have to go through this piece by piece. These are different breeding methods. And I'm talking about this because the different crops that you have are going to be bred in different ways, and you're going to end up with cultivars at the end that are different types. Okay. And so we'll go through this and hopefully bring some clarity to some of these topics. I mean, some of the questions that you need to think about if you're going to try to breed some crop or other is, what's the mating system? Is it cross-pollinated or is it self-pollinated? Can you develop inbred lines? If it's self-pollinated, it automatically will self-pollinate and produce inbred lines. But if it's cross-pollinated, it's going to be harder to develop inbred lines, fewer lines. Can you make hybrids? And so I want to talk about hybrids more in a little bit as well. But there's certain reasons why you might want to make hybrids in terms of uniformity of the crop and possibly yield, improved yield from hybrids. And then one of the big things to think about is, can you isolate what you're breeding from pollen coming from other plants? With self-pollinated plants, it's not usually a big problem, but with cross-pollinated plants, if it's pollinated by wind or bees, boy, you got to be careful, because you can get other pollen flowing in, and what you think is the cross you're making might not be the cross if you're not isolating plants. Okay, so clonal crops. Fruit and nut trees, for example, for the most part, are clonally propagated. They're generally cross-pollinated. Okay, you start out as a breeder, you start out with a whole population of plants. You find the ones that are the best, and there's your variety. That's a cultivar. A clonal cultivar, of course, you're going to stick it on a rootstock and all this kind of stuff. But you start with a population, look for the best ones, and then you can release that directly as a clonal cultivar. Okay, so clonal cultivars are a little bit different from the others in that, for the most part, seed-based cultivars are not clonal. There are some, but we're not going to talk about that today. So with seeds, we're talking about these other things. Inbred lines, so pure lines, self-pollinated crops, where you start with a population that you might have made by crossing two plants. So you cross two plants, and then you have a segregating population that you inbreed. It naturally inbreeds, okay? It's self-pollinated. You evaluate for traits, and then you end up with a pure line or inbred line cultivar. Now, sometimes, and this is what that asterisk down below talks about, sometimes you have things like tomatoes that are naturally self-pollinated, and people talk about an open pollinated variety. What they mean is a pure line or an inbred line and not a hybrid. But it's open pollinated in the sense that it's just self-pollinating, and it's not getting pollen from all around from other plants. It's just self-pollinating. But it's an inbred line. So it's a pure line. If you grow tomatoes from that seed next year, it's going to be just identical to the ones you just grew. No, identical unless there's a mutation. Of course, they're rare, they're rare, but they happen. And so sometimes you have mutations. But for the most part, with inbred lines, you have something good, you grow it back, and it'll be good.
Hey, Charlie.
Yeah.
Good question. So in that inbred line row, how many years are you listing here? What's the time frame?
Oh, I'm going to get the time frame in a little bit, but
okay.
I mean, so.
But those arrows represent like
these
a grow
arrows
out.
represent, some time going by. But in general, we're talking about to go from something that's not inbred to inbred is going to take maybe five generations might be sufficient. You may want to go more to make it more pure. There'll still be a little segregation at 5 generations, but it'll be pretty stable by then. But I mean, these are the nuances of breeding that, maybe we don't have to get into real detail today, but I mean, this looks very simple, but it gets actually kind of complicated into how you might want to go about doing it. But the time frame is variable. Yeah,
I know things.
Yeah.
What enter?
So then so another type of breeding, and this is typically done with cross-pollinated crops like corn, but it's also done in different self-pollinated crops like tomatoes, for example, is to make hybrids where you have essentially this inbred line thing on two sides of a breeding program. You're developing inbreds from two different groups and then hybridizing them together to make a hybrid cultivar. And so that it's that cross at the end of two inbreds that is what's going to be planted by you as a farmer or gardener. And at this point, the inbreds aren't particularly, that you get out of this inbreeding aren't particularly interesting. What you really want are the hybrids and what the performance is of the hybrids. And so you evaluate those hybrids, but you're not taking hybrids and, self-pollinating them or cross-pollinating them to produce seed to sell. No, you're always going back to these inbreds to make this hybrid. So two inbreds crossed together, you have a hybrid, and it's F2 generation. F1 generation, and you don't go to the F2 because that good characteristics of the hybrid will break down and you'll have segregation in the F2. Okay, so hybrids is not something that would naturally happen, like inbreeding, or as we get to in a minute, outcrossing. This single cross hybrid cultivars are something that breeder makes or breeding company makes to sell so that the hybrid has some particular value, and it also sort of locks in the value because you can't take that seed from the hybrid and recover the hybrid performance. So that's sort of, if you're a cynic, you say, oh, you're doing hybrid so that I can't use your seed. But there are reasons why hybrids are valuable. There's a question in the chat. Is lack of selection and breeding program correct a no-till cover crop? I'm not, I don't know. I think there is breeding on, so the question's about cover crops, and is there a lack of breeding on cover crops? Is that the problem? I mean, undoubtedly with breeding, you might be able to improve things to some degree and make cover crops more, more viable. I think there's plenty of good cover crops now, though. I think one of the challenges is in management solutions and trying to figure out how to manage it, and of course breeding and management come together, but I don't know that breeding is the limiting step of adoption. That's something maybe we can talk about later if you want. Okay, so going on to the last box over here, the synthetic, or what's really an open pollinated cultivar. These are cross-pollinated plants. Think of corn outside of hybrid corn, or you could think of something like zinnias or alfalfa. Generally, outcrossing plants are simply populations, right? So it's like this group of us here on Zoom, we're a population, and you evaluate all the individuals in the population, take the best ones, intercross them, and now you have a new population that might be of a new variety. And you take that population and let it intercross in the field to produce more seed, let it intercross again to produce enough seed to sell, and that's the variety. So a synthetic variety or an open pollinated variety is intercrossing naturally in the field to produce seed in isolation from any other pollen that's going to be around. Okay, so now again, this open pollinated meaning for tomatoes is not in the same sense because they're inbred. So they're not getting pollen from everywhere, any other tomato plant around, it's just themselves. Okay, so there's lots of details in the methods in here in the middle of going from the starting population, getting down to the new cultivar, but this is the general sense of how it works. Okay, so here's some time frames. So this is alfalfa, again, hybridized parents and produce lines or families, something to evaluate in the field that you can evaluate. These are little families of alfalfa, these little blocks. There's a couple hundred of them in this plot. There's another couple hundred over here in this plot. And then we have another location with 400 plots trying to find high yielding alfalfa. Okay, so crossing alfalfa and then developing lines, maybe takes 1 or 2 years, families to evaluate. You're going to evaluate in the target environment. Of course, this is a perennial crop, so it's going to take more time. But typically, this evaluation phase and evaluation during inbreeding as well, in a crop like wheat or something, it's going to take 2 to 5 years. And then you need to, so that's sort of the breeding, okay? You've kind of picked the best things, and then you go into trialing, and that's going to take some amount of time. So this is an important part of plant breeding is evaluating what you've developed and making sure that it works well. And so this is where the time is sort of, a substantial amount of the time before you end up getting over here into the seed multiplication and release to the growers is in this trialing phase to make sure that what you've developed over here in the breeding phase is good. And so there's no way to really shortcut this. You have to plan it out. If you're talking about trees, fruit trees, nut trees, you may want to have trialing for 10 or 15 years. So you don't plant an orchard and 15 years from now have everything die when you're expecting it to live to 30 years, right? So from a breeding standpoint, it's always this challenge of getting something new out, but making sure you have enough evaluation information to ensure it's going to do well for folks when it gets out there. Okay, so I often hear breeding is slow. 6 to 15 years, maybe 25 years for some trees, until you get a new cultivar. But, once this pipeline is in place, then new stuff keeps coming out of it as long as the pipeline keeps running. You're always hybridizing, you're always evaluating, you're always testing, and you're always multiplying seed of the best things at the end. So once it gets going, you can have new cultivars come out regularly, and you don't get to the end here and start all over again. Okay, so that's sort of the gist of a breeding program. The real grist, if you want to think of it that way, of a breeding program is genetic variation. If you don't have genetic variation, then you're dead. You're not going anywhere. And so here's an example. This is some extreme variation when we were starting a hemp breeding program a few years ago, looking at all types of different sources of hemp germplasm. And you have everything from these really nice big colas here to things that have hardly any colas, real branchy and leggy and so on. And so genetic variation, though, is what you need to start with if you're going to produce new varieties, because you have to be able to select the different traits you need, cross the plants together to get those into a single cultivar, whether that's inbred or a synthetic or hybrid or whatever, and then continue the process repeatedly. Typically, in a breeding program, you'll see this initial diversity being very broad. Very quickly, a lot of this gets weeded out, and then you start concentrating on the good stuff and trying to make the good stuff even better. The other important part of breeding, in addition to just having variability, is recombination. And this is probably the key concept, really. And that is, you have genetic variation. This inbred line or this plant has this trait. This inbred line, this plant has this other trait. We want to put them together and get both traits into one plant. Or we would just want to cross plants and try to get, even higher yield or even more quality characteristics and so on. So hybridization, cross-pollinating by hand, individual plants is the key concept to be getting new variation for continuing selection. So this is a picture of spinach, males and females, and we put them in the isolation in the greenhouse and let them cross by wind. So just wind pollination. It's actually the amount of pollen that male spinach plants produce is just astonishing. Oh, there's a chat thing. Yeah, so so this is an interesting point here about heirloom traits. So there's no doubt that as large commercial breeding programs have gone on, breeding has gone in certain directions, right? So strawberries have been bred for shippability. Tomatoes have been bred for shippability. And to some extent, that trait overarches everything else that's being selected. And so certain things on taste or quality or other, things that are hard to harvest, that kind of thing, have fallen by the wayside. And some of those traits are really valuable from a consumer standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, and so on. And so I think that's, those are the types of characteristics that we can think about when we think about breeding, individuals breeding their own varieties or smaller seed companies finding niches to come in where we can deal with some of these problems that have been introduced as a consequence of the production system that maybe the larger companies are shooting at. Yeah, and I mean, inadvertently, breeders can select for things that are undesirable. There's no doubt about that. Here, just the procedure in alfalfa of hybridizing. It's actually pretty easy to go in and we use these little paper boats to essentially we play a bee and go around and trip individual florets into that pollen pool that we build up, and eventually get all these nice pods, and eventually we get seeds. And so that's making crosses that will develop a new population, hopefully improve population of alfalfa. So speaking of heirlooms, a number of years ago, Paul Gepps, who's the bean breeder here, and graduate student Travis Parker had gotten some funding from the Lundberg Foundation to look at some heirloom beans. And then later on, this became part of our SCOPE project, which is student-led projects that Travis led, trying to develop heirloom beans with resistance to bean common mosaic virus. And it was quite successful. Actually, they got their resistance from an elite commercial cultivar initially, but then there were some problems subsequently, and so they ended up having to go back to a non-elite source of resistance. But in any case, the idea was simply to take these varieties, like in this case, you see Tiger's Eye. We have a whole series of these, and cross in this BCMV resistance, and also select among the progeny for higher yield. And this was quite a successful program. You can see that you see Tiger's Eye, which is the Tiger's Eye with the resistance, looks very similar across these different environments. And so, but notice the environmental effect of growing these. But you can see that introgression hasn't really affected things. So this is a way to take heirlooms that have maybe fallen out of favor because they just get this virus, and bring them back into favor. And one reason to grow them, why people like them, in addition to just they look cool, is that they have better taste. And so in taste tests, the taste of these new varieties hasn't diminished relative to the originals. So the breeding was targeted and was successful in bringing in resistance and even increasing yield a little bit. So one of the problems with a lot of heirlooms is that they don't have disease resistance. They aren't adapted to today's environment of whatever, whether that's hotter nights or these kind of things. And so, heirlooms in and of themselves aren't necessarily well adapted, or aren't necessarily maybe even desirable in many ways, but they usually have some characteristic that's good. And often we try to capitalize on those good characteristics and put it into a more robust genetic background, say they can survive, and so on. We're doing a little through the SCOPE project, the student-led project. So here's some students out in the field making crosses. So zinnias bee pollinated. So you've got to isolate flowers that you're crossing from bees so they don't come in and mess up what you're trying to hybridize. But as an outcrossing crop, we're looking at a open pollinated variety or synthetic variety. And so it's hard initially anyway to get uniformity that you would see in an inbred line where everything's identical. And so that's one of the challenges of outcrossing crops, is trying to stabilize the variation that you have in a population, so that, for example, you fixed a certain flower color, and so everything will have that flower color, even though individual plants aren't genetically uniform. And now you could go through the process of inbreeding. Often with outcrossing crops, there's a problem of trying to get over inbreeding depression, so that plants you can inbreed plants sufficiently to make them pure lines, and then make hybrids. But in this case, we're just trying to do open pollinated varieties, so that anybody can use the variety and breed with it subsequently. Okay. Now, one of the things that I'm kind of interested in, I'm not going to maybe spend a whole lot of time on this, is participatory breeding, or involving farmers or gardeners with our breeding program, where farmers can be involved at various levels, whether farmers are only doing trialing at the end, or whether farmers in this other in the middle here, farmers are actually involved in looking at segregating populations, picking out what they like, and working with breeders to make crosses of desirable plants and so on. But the idea of involving farmers or gardeners in breeding programs is particularly useful when there's certain characteristics that different communities are interested in, and maybe for cultural reasons, maybe for other reasons in the past, or just a particular interest that someone has. Maybe the varieties that are coming out of other breeding programs, academic or private breeding programs, just don't have the traits that you want. And so by involving farmers in breeding, it gives the opportunity to identify characteristics maybe that wouldn't otherwise have been selected, or varieties that wouldn't have been developed. And so with scope, we're trying to do both on-farm evaluations as well as breeding if someone's interested, so that we can have sort of a broader view of what gets selected and what varieties ultimately are developed and commercialized. Okay, let's talk about intellectual property protection. So, in the old days, things used to be great in some ways. Public breeding programs were always breeding things. Somebody would call you up, you want some seed? I would like seed of your new variety or your new breeding lines or stuff. Here you go, send it off. Those days are over. Everybody wants material transfer agreements to trial things. Everybody wants to protect their germplasm. Well, I shouldn't say everybody, a lot of people. And it's become much more difficult to access germplasm. And that means access the material that goes into the beginning of the breeding program because of all these different types of protection. So things like contracts, trade secrets, and then more legally, with I shouldn't say there's legal protections on those as well. Plant variety protection or plant breeders' rights, where you can protect the variety you've developed. And then even utility patents, which is mind-boggling to me that they can be issued on a plant variety, but nevertheless they are. And so using these different types of protection, they limit what somebody can do with the seed that they buy. There's also the plant patents from the 1930 U.S. Plant Patent Act for asexually reproducing species that provides a level of protection for the inventor. Now, on the one hand, intellectual property protection is problematic in the sense that it limits free access and free flow of germplasm, which at some point is going to have a detrimental effect on improving crops overall. On the other hand, and what's the point of a lot of the protection, is to enable breeders to get some way to get paid, essentially. And it's not cheap running a breeding program, and so there needs to be some way to reward breeders. Even just if they're trying to earn a livelihood, and so that's often why breeders are interested in hybrids too, because they don't breed true, and so you can get a hybrid, and that sort of is a way for you to capitalize on your investment. Okay. So here's sort of a breakdown of these different types of protection. So if there's no protection, you can save seed, you can sell seed, and you can breed with it. And these types of, varieties with no protection are becoming more or less frequent, new varieties anyway. There's lots of old varieties. Heirloom varieties essentially fall into this category, and land races fall into this category. Sure, you can do whatever you want if you can access them from the germplasm system, from wherever the source might be. But newer varieties might have something like plant variety protection, PVP, which gives you the ability to save seed. Okay, what's this asterisk? If it's a hybrid F1, it'll segregate in the F2. So I got a mistake. Okay, so if it's a hybrid and you're going to save the seed, it'll be F2 seed and it'll segregate and not breed true. So you can save seed, but you might not get what you want just because it's a hybrid. But yes, you're allowed to save seed, but you can't sell seed. So you can't produce seed and then sell it of a PVP variety without the agreement of the breeder or the company that developed it. So with a lot of these things, you can get around the prohibition by entering into a legal agreement with the developer. But PVP, most people believe, gives you the ability to breed with the variety. And so you can't sell something that's just the same. You can't just pretend to breed with it. You have to make crosses and get recombination and so on. But you usually, generally, it's generally agreed you can breed with a PVP variety, which is great. And so the breeder gets value back by preventing the sale of the seed, but it also allows it to go out into the seed commons and allows you to breed in the future. With the plant patent, these are often clonal, and so there may not even be seeds, but if there were, almost always these are cross-pollinated species, and so it's not going to breed true if you do get seed. You get seed out of an apple that has a plant patent, it's not going to breed true. And then, of course, there's not going to be seeds. So can you breed with? This is a sort of interesting question. Actually, the plant patent law says you cannot use any part of the plant or for propagation purposes or anything. And so since pollen is part of the plant, technically you cannot breed with any asexually propagated crop that has a plant patent. That may not be widely appreciated, but that's what the law says. Now, with utility patents, you can't do anything. You get a utility patent, you can't do anything unless you talk to the company or the breeder and get a license. And then maybe you'll be able to. There'll be some restrictions and so on. And then things like bag tags, you might get a tag where they might just say on the bag, you can't save seed, you can't sell it, you can't breed with it, and so on. In which case, legally, you're not allowed to do it. Although, I mean, the bag tag could say you could. Okay, so basically, all these types of intellectual property protection have some restrictions. And with the exception of PVP, there's a real limit on what you can do for breeding. Now, you may not know if a variety has a utility patent, and it's hard to find out in some cases. So it's really problematic if you want to do some hybridization yourself, take varieties that are on the market. You may end up with a variety that's patented, you don't realize it, and make crosses. If you try to sell that, the company that has the original variety can go in with genetic markers, and they'll be able to tell that you use their variety. So it's a somewhat dangerous territory to breed with cultivars when you're not sure if they're patented. So one of the things that I think that in our scope project that we have is funded by the USDA organic program, we're not getting any intellectual property protection on the varieties we release. So anybody can do whatever they want with them. Now, there is another type of protection of sorts called the Open Source Seed Initiative. This hasn't been tested legally, so it's not entirely clear what legal legs this might have, but the OSSI takes the form of a pledge. And the pledge is this, that you have the freedom to use these seeds any way you choose, but you pledge not to restrict anyone else's use of them. And so in some ways, this is better than an open release, because someone could take something you freely release and then patent it or patent a derivative of it. The OSSI pledge is that anybody can take the seeds, use it, and use it in breeding or whatever, but that they cannot then say we're going to patent what comes out of our breeding program. And so the idea would be to keep seeds in the commons for everybody to use in breeding and and for sale and so on, rather than try to tie it up with intellectual property protection. And I think there's certainly cases where this makes a lot of sense. We're thinking about releasing varieties through OSSI from the Scope project for this very reason. But the counter argument, of course, always is the breeder or the breeding company has to be able to recoup some of the investment they've made in varieties, and trying to figure out how we can keep seed in the open commons and still make sure that breeders get enough money to keep going. I'm talking even just you know, the one person breeding companies. They have to be able to get some money. So figuring out how to make that work is somewhat of a challenge. And I think it's something that we need to really think about as a community. And maybe the solution really is something like PVP, which essentially does that. Okay, I think I've talked enough. So thank you. If there's any questions, this is a scope pepper that we're getting ready to release at a sun scald resistance. This one happens to be in the greenhouse, but and I'll just mention some of the funders and folks who are working with us on this scope project as well. So thank you.